Welcome to Agape Ministries podcasts, a whole new way of thinking. Episode 8, Part 2 of John Shea's teaching on the spiritual wisdom of the gospel.
Tell the disciples who are all in a quandary about this, because the poet understands that the disciples don't get it. And the reason the disciples don't get it in the Gospels is so that we can watch them not get it. And watching them not get it, we can begin to get it. Okay? So the poet says, look at them, they think he has done this unjustly to me. They don't understand that they could have ripened in his presence. They could have given gifts of understanding and compassion. He said, but worst of all, because they failed to respond, they left undeveloped gifts unimagined. Okay? That's what the fruit is. The fruit is gifts unimagined. And the reason in spiritual teaching they're unimagined is when you're in darkness, you don't know the light. Until you engage the process. Once you engage the process, things come about which you thought could never, ever, 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 ever have come about. Okay? The mind loves impossibility. It creates impossibility at every stage, at every moment. It knows we cannot more than it knows we can. That's why what the angel says to Mary after he instructs her on what is going to happen, he says, don't you understand? Nothing is impossible with God. Don't you get that? And of course, she doesn't, because nobody gets it. The only ones who get it are the ones who are living it. Until we begin to live it, we won't get most of what the Gospels have to say. The corresponding imagination of the disciple to the imagination of the texts is absolute. So that's how I got myself into this. Okay. I started out telling stories and then got embarrassed by the fact that every time I would tell stories from other spiritual traditions or stories from Christian traditions, and they'd say, tell a gospel, or I'd tell stories from Genesis, I'd tell Elias stories, tell the Joseph stories, tell those great stories from the Hebrew Scriptures. They say, tell a gospel. So I go, it happens too fast. If I tell it straight, it happens too fast. The listener doesn't get a chance. And I have to work very hard as a teller even to get close to what is happening, say, for long periods of time. I said, why are they built like this? Okay? And I said, I was working, as I said, with Zachary and Mary and Gabriel. I began to think, these are examples of higher wisdom, and these dialogue exchanges are very difficult to get. And the only way Mary goes beyond Zachary is she ponders. We've got to take a different attitude toward these things. Okay? These texts are meant to continually open the one who ponders them into the spiritual dimension of life, which is always present, which is always active, and always elusive. Always just on the edge of consciousness, what James called the difference between focal consciousness and fringe consciousness. They're always on fringe consciousness, and pulling fringe consciousness into focus is really hard to do. Okay? That's the first part of spiritual wisdom, the Gospels. Let me stop there, and let's just turn to your neighbor who won't bite. I've been told that in good authority. Turn to your neighbor who won't bite, and what do you hear in this stuff that interests you? What do you hear in this stuff that you'd want to nuance or modify? Let's debrief, and then I'll tell you how this approach began to get put into a setting for preachers and teachers. Okay. Well, let's talk to each other a little bit in groups of 2 or 3. Just turn to your neighbor, chat for about 5 minutes. Good. Okay. Now, let me sort of move it into another area. My friend and someone who Barnaby knows, Father Wayne Prist, was running an operation called the Center for Development and Ministry. And he had the bright idea that what would really be helpful for preachers and teachers preceding the Advent Christmas season and preceding the Lenten season was to throw a day where people would come together, where they would take a look at the Sunday readings, sort of give them, if they were going to preach or do reflection on the readings or teach the readings in RCA or teach it in various other formats, they could come together and they could get a leg up on the season by going through the whole thing as one package before it started, and that would really be a good idea. And I was on the consulting group that did that. I said that'd be a good idea. And I said you should get a scripture scholar, to go through the day with the readings. And Wayne turned to me and said, I was thinking of you. I said, but I'm not a scripture scholar. And Wayne knew lots of scripture scholars because he ran a thing called the Summer Scripture Institute every summer for 2 weeks, and he had brought in people from all over the world. And I said, why don't you just do that and that'll work? He said, no, because Wayne gets phrases in his mind, okay? And the phrase he had in his mind, which he said was not his phrase, but which he heard from other people was, I do my homework and I have nothing to say. That was his phrase. I do my homework and I have nothing to say. What he meant was, I read all the commentaries, I read the scholars, and I still have nothing to say. In other words, what he was reading, he couldn't find a way to translate into teaching and preaching. He said, this stuff you're fooling around with now, why don't you do that? I said, well, it's the same problem. It's the same problem as using the historical critical method or a theological literary method on scripture text. The method I'm using, which is sort of literary spiritual, trying to get at the wisdom, spiritual wisdom, it has the same problem. I don't know what you're going to say. I don't know how you're going to translate this into preaching or teaching, so I think it has the exact same problem. He said, no, I don't think it does. Why don't you try to do that? And I said, well, okay, we'll do one time. I said, but I got to really tell you that we can't do all 3 readings. First of all, just given the length of the day. But secondly, I'd always worried about my own way I use scripture because I was very lopsided. I did widen because I would only meditate on the Gospels. And then because the Gospels pick up so much of the Hebrew Scriptures, I'd find myself going back, if I was meditating on John, I'd find myself going back much more deeply into Genesis, or if I was meditating on Luke, I'd find myself much more deeply in the Psalms, so I would find myself going back into the Hebrew Scriptures, and I would find myself going forward into the other books of the New Testament and understanding the complex theological arguments in light of the type of spiritual perceptions that were beginning to unfold within the gospel story. So I was getting wider, but I just felt that there was no way I was going to try to take on these other readings. He said, that's okay, just do the Gospels. I didn't want to hear that, actually. I wanted to hear, you're right, Jack, we should bring in a scripture scholar, but I didn't get that. So I said, okay, let's do it. I said, but only as a team, okay? I'll go through these texts, and I'll tell them how I'm beginning to read them from literary and spiritual dynamics, sort of to get at the spiritual wisdom that's present in the text. But then the other side of the team has to work, and people have to say, how can we take this and how can we move this toward preaching and teaching settings? Because I can't go there, okay? I'm not sure how this stuff can move toward preaching and teaching settings. And so we started a series of days. This was a number of years ago now. This was close to 12, 13 years ago. and the days still go on. What we do is we get together, usually sometime in the middle of November, for Advent, Christmas, and then about a week or two before Lent, and we sort of go through the texts again, and we sort of try to pull out the spiritual wisdom. And then the big feat is for the teachers and preachers to say, how can I craft this into an actual homily? How can I craft this into a lesson plan? How can I use this in teaching settings I'm going to be? Is it usable? See, because a lot of ways of going after ancient texts and even uncovering their spiritual dynamics, the question of its pastoral usage is really there. I did it with a lot of different denominations. I remember with a group of Lutherans in Minnesota. I did it, and the response was, this is really very interesting stuff, you know, and it's a dimension that we haven't seen before, but it's unpreachable. We can't use it. Okay. That was the end of that. So that becomes part of the teamwork. And so what I devised, and this was on your chairs, was just a little model. This is not the model I would normally use in pastoral settings at all. Okay. In pastoral settings, I always used an experience reflection model where the tradition got into the conversation in the moment of reflection and not in the moment of experience. Okay? This is a formation model. A spiritual reflection model that we would use would always begin with trying to figure out some type of question that was non-obtrusive, but that would allow people to go back in their memories and pull forward an experience and tell it in story form. See? So sometimes I would ask a question like, when you change jobs and move from one job to another, or you change positions within one job, what were you looking for? Okay. Then they tell the story about jobs change and say what they were looking for. Then I'd correlate that with some piece from the tradition, sometimes scripture, sometimes a piece of theology, and in the correlation between their experience and the piece from the tradition, there'd come a deeper understanding. They'd look at decisions and possibilities out of that toward action. See? Or I'd ask a question like, could you tell us about a conversation you had with your child that when you were done, you said, this is what it means to be a parent. Inside yourself said, this is what it means to be a parent. Okay. Or could you tell us a conversation you had with your child when you were done, said, this obviously is not what it means to be a parent. You know? So the whole idea in the experience reflection model was to find the right questions to surface the significant moments of people's experience that they might have walked over. And if they gave it time and let it come to the surface and looked at it, they would become wiser people, and it would be informed by faith because you'd bring part of the tradition to bear on it. It would be a faith response that they begin to connect their work and their family life with deeper faith perceptions. And that was the whole point of that model, was an experience reflection model. In the States, that model came under a lot of fire. The reason it came under a lot of fire was people said they're not getting the straight tradition. They're always getting it filtered through their experience. And besides, they can't do it. And it never gets to the tradition. It just becomes a humanistic model. And I'd say, no, that's not true. You know, and I'd tell them experiences of groups that I had been in. But the fact is, it came under a lot of fire. And a second model began to become more prominent, and that's what I would call a formation model. You began with the tradition. And you had to get people's experience in there. But you didn't begin with their experience, you began with some piece of the tradition. It could be a scripture text, it could be a couple paragraphs from an encyclical, it could be a passage from Vincent de Paul or from Ignatius Loyola, you know, or you begin to start with tradition and move tradition toward experience. This model is a formation model. You start with the Gospels. So it's over here. So gospel teaching stories. You start with the Gospels, see? And there are certain skills that I put in here on there that if you would get good at this, you would develop these types of skills for listening to the Gospel. They're pretty much close attention to the text. You know, I have their sensitivity to symbol. Tracing dialogue is so important in gospel stories, figuring out why the dialogue is going this way, you know. And sometimes you run into dead end after dead end. Sometimes scholars are tremendously helpful in this. Sometimes they don't know either, it seems to me, and they sort of decide to skip over this process. The conflict in the characters' Gospels are rife with conflict. All the conflict is spiritually significant. Okay. The second thing is you move into the middle one, and that is you begin to articulate the spiritual wisdom of the Gospels not in gospel language. Okay. We don't talk gospel language as a culture, you know. We talk a different, I don't know how you would characterize the language of your culture. In the States, I always say, we talk sort of a psychological, social mix of words and stuff like that. But it's really hard for us to figure out symbols in the States and to work with symbols. Most people, when they read John's Gospel, are completely lost, you know, because it's all wordplay on symbols, and John's trying to bring out deeper levels of consciousness. But we have to find a contemporary language of spiritual consciousness that's indebted to the gospel, that's real for people's lives, a way of talking about it. We have to find our voice. And that voice, to me, has to integrate these dimensions. Okay? One of the worst things that has happened in the history of Western spirituality is that we have found a voice of the Spirit, but it's an unintegrated voice into the social, physical, and mental dimensions of our lives, and so we live this type of split. See? I work a lot in healthcare and have for the last 8 years. Believe me, in healthcare, they don't let you get away with that. You know, they do not let you get away with that. If you talk spirituality without talking social conflicts, physical well-being, and mental states, they're not going to listen. I mean, they're going to walk out of the room. They don't wait till the break. You know? So we have to find an integrated language for being human that includes the spiritual and doesn't collapse the spiritual into the social, physical, or mental, but also doesn't talk about the spiritual down this track and the social, physical, mental down that track and pretend it's all tied together, which it isn't. See? And so this middle ground is finding a contemporary language, gospel-grounded, but also goes, if not beyond gospel, goes differently than gospel to find a way to talk. See? The third piece is the hardest piece, and that's where the preaching and teaching comes in. When you find this language, how do you integrate it into personal, cultural, and pastoral experience? Okay. This isn't an easy process. Okay. It never has been easy. It's countercultural just in the fact that it really takes this very serious, the spiritual dimension. Very, very serious. Okay. We are a multi-dimensional reality. There is definitely a spiritual dimension that is different than these dimensions, okay? So it's distinctive. Okay? The Gospels play off it over and over again. They keep telling you stories of social life, see, that make you realize social life is going to explode unless it learns to tap into this more unified dimension and integrate the more unified dimension into the mental constructs that we've developed. Who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? Where did you get that question? The moment you were born, that's where we got that question. The moment you looked down at a sibling or up at another sibling and said, I got to get more. More love from my parents, the right food at the table, and then you found out in kindergarten you were in the middle of your class. And we live competitive from the head to our feet. Every moment of our life is competition. Every inch, every second of it is competition. Who's the greatest is the question in our heart. It's been buried there from the very beginning. Okay. Unless it is modified, that question will kill us. All those images. That question, if we don't modify that question, it's going to kill us. But how do you modify a question that is built into the very fabric of social reality? Here it is. We have borne the heat of the day, and you have made them equal to us by giving them the same wage. You can feel that, can't you? Okay? That's social reality. Okay? Competitive at every level. And competitive produces excellence. Yeah, it does. It also produces death. So how do you modify it? There's a spiritual dimension that'll teach you to work with the social competitiveness. See? Especially how the social dimension is ingrained in mental categories. It'll hit the mental categories question. See? So how these things come together is part of spiritual wisdom. Spiritual wisdom, here's the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And this tells you the gospel take on spiritual wisdom in ways that other passages don't. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, after Jesus has poured out all this combination of spiritual consciousness and ethical action, love of God and love of neighbor, poured this whole mold out in Matthew's way of saying it. He says, if you hear these words of mine and put them into action. So the hearing process has to unfold into an action process. If you hear these words of mine and put them into action. The hearing is not just that he talked loud enough, like the joke in Monty Python's The Life of Brian. Did he say, blessed are the cheesemakers? It's not just not just whatever in the gospel. Hear doesn't mean just sound. Hear means comprehension. So it's always a way of comprehension and action. See? So if you understand these things, after Jesus washes their feet in John's gospel, if you understand these things, blessed are you if you do them. If you don't understand them in gospel teaching, doing won't unfold. So you have to have consciousness and action. Okay? A lot of the consciousness that you have to have is around identity. In the Epistle of James, James says, why are people just hearers of the word, not doers of the word? How's that? How come they can keep hearing the word and not be a doer of the word? He says, well, they're like people who have looked into a mirror, seen their original face, and then walked away and forgotten it. Okay? The question of forgetfulness. That's why we go back week in and week out to these texts. We forget the deepest truth about ourselves because we are immersed in exciting physical and social adventures. But it's very difficult for people to take spiritual consciousness and their spiritual identity into those physical and social adventures and turn them life-giving. It's a very hard thing to do. See? And so we're working with the question of forgetfulness. If you hear these words of mine and put them into action, if you can put this stuff together, well, then you will be like a wise person. This is wisdom in the Gospels. It isn't intellectual. It's this ability to know and do. See? You will be like a wise person who builds their house upon a rock. When the winds blow and the storms slash and the rivers rise, that house will stand, for it's built on rock. This is how they saw it. Spiritual consciousness can withstand social and physical storm. Okay? But if you don't have it, but if you are a person who merely hears these words of mine and does not work on it, does not put them into action, well, then you are like a foolish person. Wise and foolish. You're like a foolish person who builds their house on sand, and when the storms comes and the rains slash and the rivers rise, that house will fall. Great will be the fall thereof. They thought that spiritual consciousness gave you a place to stand, what some scholars call the pivot of the wobbling world. Okay? The world wobbles. Okay? And when it wobbles, you'll wobble with it. Okay? Unless you have a place to stand. Unless you can ground your physical and social life in spiritual depth. Okay? Then you'll withstand. Okay? But if you don't, you'll fall. Matthew loves contrast all the time, all the way through his gospel, loves contrast, puts everything together as contrast. If you're looking for a middle way, do not read St. Matthew. You know, it's always one way or the other way. But contrasts are effective rhetoric because they show two different paths. You've got to have this. Okay? I think that's as true today as it was back in the Gospels. When I first started teaching catechetics, I taught in the inner city. We didn't call it catechetics. Religion in the morning, boxing and baseball in the afternoon. You know? The neighborhood was very rough and tumble, and but it had these old school building and this old church, and between there was a gangway. And in the gangway they had a bunch of chairs set up. They were wooden chairs, going all the way back. I was about 17 or 18 years old, and I was teaching boxing, baseball, catechetics. The kids who didn't show up for the religion in the morning couldn't do the boxing and the baseball. Rice Christianity never flourished so widely. They were all there. They were all lined up and sitting there. And in those days, I just had boys, and the sisters had the girls. And I had no idea what I was doing, nor did I know what to do, nor could I keep control over them. And so they were starting boxing during religion. You know? They were punching each other and fooling around. The pastor's name was Father Brown. He was a very nice guy. And he was wandering between the church building and the school building and saw that my classroom outside in the gangway was up for grabs. And he came and he took one of the wooden chairs and he started beating with the wooden chair against the wall of the building. Pretty soon all the kids who were laughing and shoving and pushing and hitting each other just stared as he, for a good 2 or 3 minutes, took the chair. As it broke to pieces, he would pick up a piece of it and keep banging it against the side of the building till everybody, myself, all the kids, were completely silent. And then he turned to him and said, "That's what they're going to do to you. If you have nothing inside yourself, and you know it, once you move outside this gangway, you go into that neighborhood, and that's what they're going to do to you. They're going to do it to you unless you have something inside you, and you know it, and you know it." And then he walked away, and they were all paralyzed for 45 seconds before they started hitting again, and I lost control. But it was his attempt to put me in control. But it stands out in my mind because he knew that they knew, and he was telling them what we were giving them. I wasn't doing it very well. But the last paragraph of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount knows exactly what he was talking about. You know, unless you build it on rock, that storm's going to wipe you out. Oftentimes we do not look at the outer circumstances of our lives with quite that furor. They did in that neighborhood every day. So that's a little bit about spiritual wisdom of the Gospels and the movement toward using it as a basis for preaching and teaching. We're going to break now, and then we're going to do some group work, right? And you're going to talk about that. But might I suggest this? If this is, whatever you want to do in the groups is fine. Might I suggest, when we come back, then we're going to have a large group conversation. What did you hear in some of the things I touched on that you might want to hear more about, that you might want to hear expanded? What didn't you hear that you want to hear something about? You know, you came here knowing the topic, and you might have said, "Gee, for sure I thought it would be about this," and I didn't get anywhere near that. So when we come back together, we can work with what we need to have expanded and what we need to have addressed that hasn't been addressed. Okay?
Okay, Kathy, part 2 of The Spiritual Wisdom of the Gospel by John Shea. What struck you?
I related the bit that when he shared about, unless you build on rock, if the storm comes, you'll be wiped out. And I was tying that to the other part that he was saying, I do my homework, but I have nothing to say. In other words, you can't really translate what you're hearing into action because you haven't made it your own. You haven't built it on rock. It has to be tied in with what the Lord has given you to share. And that meant a lot. It made a lot of sense to me. That I really thought that was brilliant. And so I'm praying that I can build on rock and not on sand.
Thanks, love. So thank you for listening to this episode. Kath and I pray that as you spend time with God, in God's presence, using the gift of prayer, that the spiritual wisdom of the gospel will be something that you taste in your everyday life. So until we're together again, God bless you, stay safe, and have a lovely life.